So 4.2 is going to be taught a little bit different than the way your textbook does it. If we just kind of keep stock on what we're doing in chapter 4 here, we started off with factoring and talking about what factoring is, and then we talked about greatest common factor. From there, we moved on to saying always look at greatest common factor, but then how you factor, your strategies for factoring are going to be based on how many terms you see. And so we did greatest common factor in 4.1 and what to do when you saw 4 terms. And that was that factoring by grouping business. We're going to do today in this 4.2 and also next day in 4.3 what you see when there are 3 terms. And when you see 3 terms, our general strategy is going to be the AC test. Okay, so we need to talk about what the heck that means. And so what we're doing with this in the 3 terms, this is the general form of stuff that we're seeing. So we've got an x squared term, an x term, and a nothing term. They're stepping down from squared to 1 to nothing. And so it's in descending order. It always has to be in descending order for this. And typically, the only difference between 4.2 and 4.3 is that there is an a value on the x squared term. And so we're going to talk about this as the AC test. In 4.2, we've got a 1 in the place there. It's invisible. It's not written as the a, but the a coefficient of 1 on the first term, on the x squared term. So in these ones, what we're going to do is the reverse of FOIL. So FOIL would have us go from 2 brackets, so an x plus 1 and an x plus 1. This would be chapter 3 and FOIL. We'd have an x squared and a plus 2x and a plus 1, right? Now, we're going to learn in this chapter, in this part of this chapter, how to do it in reverse. So how are we going from my trinomial to my 2 binomials? And so this is chapter 4. And to get there, we need the AC test. So to find the product of 2 binomials, we FOILed it out to make a trinomial. Now we're going to learn how to go the other way, to factor a trinomial into its 2 binomial factors. And so this is the example of that. So not the example I put at the top, but if you had these 2, you could FOIL it. And that's what we learned in chapter 3. We're now going to factor it as in chapter 4. So the way we do this is that we take a look at what is A and what is C. And so I know there's no A there, but we'd have a 9. And I think about all the ways that I could break down 9. I could factor 9. So I'd have 1 and 9, and that's it. So that's the way that I could satisfy my AC test. So this little number puzzle has a second criteria. So we need the factors that multiply to give me this 9, but we want them to add together to give me my B term, I say. And my B term in this is a 10. So that would add together to give me a 10. So we break down that middle term. This is factoring by decomposition sometimes if you're using alternative videos to support your learning in this course. So we decompose that 10x into 9x and 1x. Haven't changed the value of this. Now we have 4 terms. And so I factor by grouping, factor out my greatest common factor, which is my binomial, and write what's left over. And so this is my way of going from my trinomial down to my 2 binomials. And so this is the way to factor something when I see 3 terms together. So that's a whole lot of mumbo jumbo. Let's try this, and hopefully we'll try enough of them that they'll make some sense to you. So when I take a look at the first one here, I've got a 1 times 8. So I'm going to start with a little number puzzle, and I'm going to have an 8 at the top of it. I'm going to factor 8 as many ways as I can. So I could have 1 and 8 and 2 and 4. Now I need to choose which sets of numbers would actually add together to give me my B term, give me my middle term. Well, 1 and 8 would add together to give me 9. So those are the values that are going to decompose my middle term. And so I'm going to recopy the first term as x squared, and I'm going to break this plus 9x apart into plus x and plus 8x. I don't want to change the value of it, I just change the way it looks. And I recopy that plus 8. Now I've made my trinomial into a polynomial with 4 terms. And we know how to factor something with 4 terms in this strategy of factoring by grouping. So I put in my funky brackets just so I could look at 2 terms at a time. They don't imply multiplication here. And the first 2 terms, I can see that I have an x common to both. Write down my brackets. I'm going to fill those brackets up with what's left over when I divide that common factor out of each term. So I'll be left with an x and a plus 1. Then I take a look at the next 2 terms and I can see that I have a positive sticking out the front and I have an 8 that would be common to both of those. So I put down my brackets and I fill those brackets up with what's left over when I divide that greatest common factor out. So that would leave me with an x and a plus 1. And I'm back to this point, the point I love, where these 2 brackets match. And so now I've identified that as my greatest common factor. So I write that one down. And I put down the brackets and I fill those brackets up with what's left behind if I were to divide that out. And so this time I'll show that just one time. So that wipes out and I'd be left with an x and a plus 8. And this is my factored form and I should be able to check it. I'm going to do one of these. I should be able to FOIL it out. First, outside, inside. Whoops, I forgot my X on that. And last. And I should be able to get back to my original question just to check my work as I go. So this was chapter 4. Oops, sorry. This is factoring. And this is checking my work. And that's what we learned with FOIL in chapter 3. So this is round and round in a circle, so don't get caught in that loop. Let's take another look at another one here. So this is my trinomial. So I'm going to try my AC test. I've got a 1 out the front here times 16. So top of my number puzzle, I'd write a 16. Before I get too worried about anything, I'm just going to factor 16 in as many ways as I can. Then I have to take a look back to decide which pair of factors would finish my number puzzle here, this little problem that I have, because I want my factors to add together to give me my B term. So this was A, B, and C as far as the coefficients go. So 2 and 8 would add together to give me a 10. And so those are the numbers that are going to decompose my middle term. So I'd have an x squared, a positive 2x, a positive 8x, and a positive 16. I've expanded this to 4 terms, so now I could factor by grouping. I take a look at the first 2 terms and I have an x common to them. Factoring that x out and filling up the brackets with what's left behind, I'm left with an x plus 2. Then I turn my attention to the next 2 terms. I see a positive sticking out the front, so it's a positive 8 as a greatest common factor. Put down my brackets and fill that up with what's left behind when I divide that greatest common factor out of each term. And now again, I've got this common binomial factor. I've got this that I recognize now as my greatest common factor. So I write my greatest common factor out the front, put down my brackets, and fill it up with what's left behind if I were to divide that greatest common factor out of my 2 terms. And so that should give us my 2 binomials that I could FOIL out and check that they do indeed go back to my original question. 2 more on the page here, and so I'm going to AC test these, do my little number puzzle. So I'd have a 1 times 5, so 5 at the top of my number puzzle, factor 5 in as many ways as I can, and I'm done. It's not hard to choose the factors here because I only have one option. They should add together to give me my B coefficient. So they do add together to give me 6. So that's what I decompose my middle term with. So I'd have an x squared, a plus x, and you could write plus 1x if you like, it means the same thing, a 5x, and a plus 5. I've made my trinomial into a polynomial with 4 terms, and my strategy for factoring when I have 4 terms is factoring by grouping. I see that I have an x common to the first 2 terms, so I write down my x as my greatest common factor, put down my brackets, going to fill it up with what's left behind when I divide that out. Then I turn my attention to the second two terms. I can see that I've got a positive sticking out the front here, so it's a positive 5 as the greatest common factor of those two terms. Putting down my brackets and dividing my common factor out, filling up those brackets, I'd be left with an x and a plus 1. So now my bracket is my greatest common factor, so x plus 1 is my greatest common factor. I'm going to fill up my second set of brackets with what's left behind if I were to factor that out of each term. So I've got that as my factored polynomial. Another one here, I've got 1 times 20, so at the top of my number puzzle I'd have a 20. I'd factor 20 in as many ways as I can. And I'm going to have to choose which combination of factors satisfy the second criteria of my number puzzle. And so they're all factors of 20, but only one set of factors is going to add together to give me my B term. So 2 and 10 would add together to give me 12, which is my B term. So in this one, I'd have an x squared, a plus 2x, a plus 10x, and a plus 20 now. I'm going to factor by grouping. I see that I have an x common to the first two terms, and factoring that out, I'd be left with an x plus 2. The next two terms, I see that I've got a plus there, and it's a plus 10 as a common factor, and factoring that out would leave me with an x plus 2. So now I have x plus 2 and x plus 10. So just as a little recap, this AC test thing. AC, that product goes at the top of your number puzzles, and then you're going to factor it down here, and you're going to choose the numbers that add together to give you your B term. Remembering that we have ax squared plus bx plus c as my standard trinomial form. Okay, so we're going to practice using some of those on the next page. Your textbook has made some attempt to have a different strategy. We're going to just go with the same and see where that puts us. Okay, so we've got three terms here. I have a 1 and an 18, so that leaves me an 18 at the top of my number puzzle. I'm going to factor 18 in as many ways as I can. And I'm going to choose my factors because they should add together to give me my B term. My B term here is negative 11. So my question is, how do we get negative 11 when we add these together? What if all my factors were negative? So negative 1 times negative 18 would give me a positive 18. Negative 2 times negative 9 would give me a positive 18. So this one would actually fit because if I added them together, I'd get a negative 11. So it has switched things up a little bit. My strategy is similar, but now I'm going to have to consider signs. In those first four examples, all my signs were positive, which gave us an intro to this AC test without having to concern ourselves with signs. Now when I do this one, I'm going to go and do it the same way. It's not that much different. So I've decomposed my middle term after I figured out which numbers fit my number puzzle. I'm going to factor by grouping, pulling an x out of the first two terms and a negative 9 out of the second two terms. Watch your signs here. We're dividing by negative 9 in both cases. And so my factored form would be this x minus 2 and x minus 9. And it might be worth checking this one. You've got some funky signs going on. So I should be able to FOIL this out and get back to my original question. Oops, positive 18. And I do. And so that checks my work. And again, that's chapter 3, understanding. Getting to the answer that's in the box is the chapter 4 material. That's factoring. So another one here, I've got a 1 times 12. So 12 would be at the top of my number puzzle. I'm going to factor it in as many ways as I can. And then I concern myself with this B bit. So those are all factors of 12 in my little number puzzle chart, but I need them that add together to give me a negative 13. Well, when I've got this positive, so I could have all positive factors or I could have all negative factors, and that would give me a positive 12. Now I could see that these two would actually add together to give me my B term of negative 13. So those are the factors that are going to decompose my middle term. Recopy the first term, expand the middle term, recopy the last term, and now factor by grouping. I see that I've got an x common to the first two terms, so x minus 1. And I've got a negative 12 common to the second two terms, so again, x minus 1. And sometimes in these negative signs, it's worth showing your work. Now that I've got the x minus 1 as my common binomial factor, I write that down, and I fill up the brackets with what's left over when I divide that out of each term. So we're going to keep moving on here. The next thing, we've got more negatives. We're going to go about this in the same strategy. So I've got a 1 times negative 15. So I'm going to have a negative 15 at the top of my number puzzle. I'm going to factor a negative 15 in as many ways as I could. So I can have 1 and 15 or 3 and 5. And I know to get to a negative 15, one's going to have to be positive and one's going to have to be negative. To make a decision on that, I take a look at the sign on my B term. So because my B term is positive, that means that the bigger terms get to be positive. And that helps me to narrow down on which combination of factors are going to be the ones that I use to decompose my middle term, because these two should give me my B term, which is a positive 2. So do keep track of your signs. They're really important. We're going to use those, our number puzzle, to decompose our middle term and switch our trinomial to a polynomial with 4 terms so we can factor by grouping. I'd have an x common to the first two terms, so x minus 3 in the bracket when I factor that x out. And I'd have a positive 5 as the common factor to my second two terms, so x minus 3 when I factor that all out. And I'd have an x minus 3 and an x plus 5 as my answer. The next one here, more complicated, but let's just see how it works. So I've got a 1 out there, so A times C would give me a negative 10 at the top of my number puzzle. I'm going to factor 10 in as many ways as I can. I see that I have a negative B term, so that means that the big ones are going to be negative and the little ones are going to be positive. So that helps me choose the factors that actually do add to my B value. So write it down and double check that you're not making a mistake. That tells me that 2 and negative 5 are what's going to decompose my middle term. So I'd rewrite the first term. I'm going to decompose the middle term, and this one's just a wee bit different. We were always keeping the variable the same because we wanted to, preserve the value. So just recopy it. And once we've expanded this into 4 terms, we're going to factor by grouping. So common to the first two terms, I'd have an x, and factoring that out would leave me with an x plus 2y. Then turning my attention to the second two terms, I have a negative 5y as my greatest common factor, and factoring that out of each of the terms, in the brackets would leave me with an x plus 2y. So now that x plus 2y is my common factor, and the x minus 5y is what's left over when I divide that out of each of my terms. So we're going to go on with these ones. Just as a reminder, in all of this factoring, we always started with our greatest common factor. It's going to knock the numbers down so you don't have massive numbers. So we know that we've got 4 terms. We're working on the 3 terms here, right? So always greatest common factor first, then move on in your strategy. So when I take a look at these, I could see that I have a 3 common to all of them. So factoring that 3 out, I'd be left with an x squared, a minus 7x, and a positive 6. Now I have a trinomial in here. So the 3 is going to be part of my answer, but I'm going to turn my attention to what I've just gone through learning. So when I have 3 terms, it's the AC test. I've got 1 times positive 6, so I'd have a positive 6 at the top of my number puzzle. Factoring it in as many ways as I can, I'd fill out my little table like that. This idea that we have a positive 6, I could have all my factors positive or all my factors negative. Because my B term is negative, all my factors are going to be negative. So the -1 and -6 are what would be the numbers that fit my number puzzle. They're going to give me the factors, or they're going to be the factors that decompose my middle term. So I'd have x squared minus x minus 6x plus 6. I'm going to have 4 terms, so I factor by grouping. I've got an x common to my first 2 terms, and factoring that out, I'd be left with an x minus 1. When I look at my second 2 terms, I've got a negative sticking out the front there, and -6 is going to be my greatest common factor. Oftentimes when I've got negative signs, I show my work so I don't make a silly mistake. And I'd have x minus 1 when I divided each term by that -6. So now I've got x minus 1 as my greatest common factor, and factoring that out, I'd be left with x minus 6. I don't want to forget about this 3. I want to preserve the value of this so it is still part of my answer. Giving the next one a shot here, and then we'll take a short break and come back and practice another page. So always greatest common factor first. So 2 would be common to all of these. Actually, whoops, 2x would be common to all of these. And factoring that out, maybe you want to show your work. I'd be left with an x squared, a plus 8x, and a minus 20. My 2x, I want to keep part of my answer, but I'm just going to turn my attention to the trinomial that I just made there. There's 3 terms, so I'm going to try this factoring with the AC test. At the top of my number puzzle would have 1 times -20, so -20. I'm going to factor that in as many ways as I can. And I have a hard time thinking of the signs right off the bat, so I put the numbers down. And then I take a look at the middle term. So I need a -20 as a product, but the sum should be a positive 8. So that means that I've got this mismatch. I'm going to have 1 be positive and 1 be negative. And I know that the bigger factors are positive because they're going to add together to give me a positive 8. So that helps me select -2 and positive 10 as the numbers that are going to decompose my middle term. So I'd have x squared minus 2x plus 10x minus 20. Put in my silly little sign so that I can just focus on two terms at a time. I have an x common to the first 2 terms, and factoring that out, be left with an x minus 2. On the next 2 terms, I have a positive 10 as a common factor, and factoring that out, I'd be left with an x minus 2. Finishing this off, I have a binomial common factor, so that bracket is my common factor, and filling the brackets up with what's left behind, if I were to factor that out or divide each term by that, I'd be left with an x plus 10. I don't want to forget about that 2x. It's still part of the party. It's still part of my answer. I don't want to change the value of this polynomial, and so I have to preserve that value by including all of the factors in my answer.